So we're going to look at the scenario of stagflation in the context of our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So on the x-axis, we have real GDP. And then on the y-axis, we have the price level, which can be reflected in the GDP deflator or the consumer price index. We have our upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve and our downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Right, and where the two intersect gives us our short run equilibrium, P star. And I'm going to go ahead and draw the long run supply curve here to set us up to begin in long run equilibrium as well. So currently we are at YP, or potential GDP, right? Now, let's suppose that something causes a negative supply shock. So this could be a universal rise in oil prices, for instance. Oil is used in the production of many goods and services. It's used to transport goods. And so when oil prices go up, that's going to increase the cost of producing many things. And we'll see that short run aggregate supply curve shift left or in. So we'll call that SRAS 2. All right, so the new short run equilibrium is going to occur here where the short run supply curve intersects the demand curve. So Y star, actual GDP, will now be below potential GDP, and we will have some inflation. So we'll call that P star 2, Y star 2. Right, so notice GDP has fallen, and so that means that unemployment is rising, right? People are losing their jobs, which is certainly something we don't, it's not a desired outcome. And then we also have inflation. So at the same time that people are losing their jobs, prices of all the things that we spend money on are rising. So this is a particularly nasty combination, high unemployment and higher prices or inflation. And so we give this a special term, stagflation. Stag stands for a stagnating economy, right? GDP is recessing, it's falling. And then the inflation part comes from this inflation we see here. So what we're going to look at now is how policymakers might address this scenario, and we'll see that it can be really challenging, right? So think from the policy maker's perspective, how we might try to deal with this. Well, unfortunately, what we'll see is we can only deal with one issue at a time. We can either close this recessionary gap here, bringing GDP back up to potential GDP, but when we do that, we're actually going to cause even more inflation. Or if we decide that inflation is way too high to exasperate, we might actually move in the opposite direction and bring price levels back down, or the inflation rate back down. But in the process, we'll see that we actually end up moving GDP even further down and therefore exasperating the unemployment problem. All right, so let's start by the first. So let's say that we decide to address this gap right here, this recessionary gap. And so we are going to use expansionary fiscal or monetary policy. So expansionary policy shifts the aggregate demand curve out to the right. And it does that by, hold on one second, here we go. It does that by either increasing government spending or lowering taxes to give households more money, which will then increase their consumer spending, right? So either of these two options increase aggregate demand through fiscal policy, right? Another option is to use expansionary monetary policy, which acts through a different component of the aggregate demand curve. Monetary policy in this scenario would actively lower interest rates, making it cheaper to borrow money. And so one of the groups that would start borrowing more money would be producers who are going to borrow money to fund investment projects, right? So when we consider the components of aggregate demand, which are consumer spending, government spending, investment spending, and net exports, right? Any of these policies, expansionary, fiscal policy or expansionary monetary policy will act on various components of aggregate demand, thereby shifting them out. So let's go ahead and shift out aggregate demand to see how it would address closing this recessionary gap down here. So as aggregate demand shifts out, we eventually end up back at potential GDP, but at a higher price level, right? So we see here we're now back to potential GDP, and so we've closed the recessionary gap. Okay, however, we have generated even more inflation, right? P star has risen even further. Okay, so what if we decided that rather than being more concerned about this unemployment caused by a recessionary gap, that it was in fact the inflation rising that we were most concerned about? Well, in that case, we would want to use contractionary policy shifting in the aggregate demand curve in order to bring down this price level, right? So this would just work exactly in the opposite of what we showed. We could either lower government spending, we could raise taxes, or we could, through monetary policy, increase interest rates, which would lower investment spending, right? Any of these things would end up decreasing aggregate demand. So let's go ahead and shift that. Right, so there's aggregate demand after contractionary policy, and we see that we end up back here now, right, with the new supply curve and the new demand curve. And so while we've brought inflation back down, right, the price level comes back down, we have actually exacerbated the recessionary gap, right? It's now larger. And so we've made the unemployment piece of our stagflation problem even greater, right? So clearly there's a trade-off when it comes to stagflation and policy in terms of which of the two problems we can address. So there is a third option, right? So we're dealing with this recessionary gap, which means we have unemployment and we don't like that. We're dealing with higher prices. We might not like that either, especially if the inflation rate's getting sort of uncomfortably high. And policy has a problem in that it can really only address one problem at a time. So an alternative would actually be to do nothing and to let the economy just self-adjust, right? Right, so how does that happen? How does that look? Well, right now we have high unemployment, right? We have unemployment that is greater than the natural rate of unemployment that we would have if we were at potential GDP. And so this means there are a lot of people who would like to have a job but don't have one. So throughout the economy, this tends to put downward pressure on wages over a long enough time period. Right, so eventually, at least in theory, wages would start falling throughout the economy because of high unemployment. And that in and of itself would create a positive supply shock, right? Bringing the supply curve back to where it originally was. And therefore, we would end up exactly back at potential GDP and the price level we began at. And so we would have no more of this high unemployment problem, and we wouldn't have this inflation problem either. Now, as you know, we've discussed before, a big caveat to this is that, you know, this could take a super long time to happen, and it might not happen at all because it's in reality, it's pretty difficult to drop wages. We might be able to slow down wage growth over time, but we're going to find it really difficult to see employers going to their existing employees and lowering their wages, right? Your boss comes and tells you, hey, you've worked here for 10 years and now you're going to get a 20% pay cut, right? We also have minimum wage laws that put sort of a lower bound on how low wages can go. And in particular industries, we have labor unions that would also really push against this action, right? And so in reality, in practice, you know, policy does play an important role. But again, when it comes to stagflation in particular, that policy is not as straightforward as it is in other types of recessionary gaps.